The blood moon had not risen in 400 years. Isolda knew this because her grandmother had spoken of it, once, in the low, guttered light of a dying candle, her voice trembling with the kind of reverence reserved for things that had no other name. The moon will bleed again when the old debt comes due. That was all she had ever said. Isolda had been 7 years old, and she had filed the memory away beside other inexplicable things. The iron lock on the cellar door, the strange herbs woven above every window, the name she was never to speak aloud. Now she was 22, and the moon above the Varenfall forest was the color of an open wound. She had not intended to be in the forest after dark. No one in the village of Ashenmere intended such things. The forest was an agreement between the living and whatever lived deeper within it, a mutual avoidance that had held for generations. But the lamplighter's horse had thrown a shoe on the eastern road, and Isolda, returning alone from the apothecary with a satchel of bitter herbs for her ailing father, had miscalculated the hour. The canopy above her was black lace against a bleeding sky. She walked quickly, her boots silent on the needle-carpeted earth, her breath controlled, and even in the way her grandmother had taught her. Panic is a scent, child, and the forest has a nose. The satchel was heavy on her shoulder. The path ahead was familiar only in daylight. She heard them before she saw them. Not wolves, or not entirely wolves. The sound was wrong, too deliberate, too organized for natural predators. 3 shapes materialized from the tree line ahead, and even in the crimson moonlight she could see that their eyes were not the amber of animals. They were silver, flat, ancient. They wore the shapes of men, but nothing about them felt human. Isolda stopped. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming in the dark only announced your location to more things than the ones already watching. The nearest shape smiled, and the expression was all wrong. Too wide, too still, like a painting attempting joy. "Bloodline of Varenfall," it said. Its voice carried no warmth, no cold, only a flatness, as though something had inhabited the sound and not quite learned its texture. The prophesied girl, finally found outside the warded walls. Isolda said nothing. Her hand found the iron clasp at her satchel strap. Iron was one of the few things her grandmother had been consistent about. "She doesn't know," said another, circling left. "Look at her. No mark, no training. They kept her entirely blind." "That makes it easier." They moved. Isolda moved first, not toward them, backward and to the left, toward the dense undergrowth where a creature wearing a humanoid shape would be slowed by the same branches as she. It was not bravery. It was calculation. She had always been better at calculating than at feeling afraid. A trait her father called stubbornness and her grandmother had called something else entirely. She made it 3 steps before the one on the right reached her, impossibly fast, a blur rather than a figure, and its cold hand closed around her forearm. Then something else arrived. She felt it before she saw it, a pressure in the air, a sudden drop in temperature so severe her breath crystallized. A silence that had weight. The creature holding her arm went very, very still. "Release her." The voice came from above. She looked up. He stood on the root arch of an ancient oak, 12 feet overhead, with the blood moon behind him and shadow pooled around him like a cloak that answered to no wind. He was tall, profoundly, architecturally tall, dressed in black, so complete it seemed to absorb the surrounding dark. His face, what she could see of it in the terrible light, was beautiful in the way old marble was beautiful. Severe, pale, carved with a precision that suggested time rather than birth. His eyes were not silver, they were black, black all the way through without the relief of color, and they were fixed on the creature holding her with an expression that was not anger. It was older than anger. It was a king's patience worn so thin it had become something close to death. "You trespass in Varenfall territory," he said. "You touch what is under this forest's protection. You do this on a blood moon, knowing what blood moons cost." A pause, precise as a blade. "Tell me honestly, did you believe I would not come?" The creatures exchanged a look. Then the one holding Isolda released her, and she stumbled back, and all 3 broke apart into the tree line and were gone, as though the forest had swallowed them whole. Silence. The thing wearing the shape of a man, descended from the arch without sound, landing on the forest floor with a stillness that made the impact feel like an impossibility. He was close now, closer than comfort allowed. Isolda looked up at him. He looked down at her. And then something happened that she would not understand until much later. His expression changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence of surprise, subtly. A fractional stillness deeper than the stillness that had preceded it, as though some internal mechanism had encountered something it had not been prepared to find. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they recognize from a dream they cannot name. "You should not be here," he said. His voice, up close, was not what she expected. It was low, measured, carrying the cadence of a language older than the one he was speaking. As though English was a translation and some other tongue was the original. "I was going home," Isolde said. A long pause. "You are not afraid," he said. It was not a question. It was something closer to bewilderment, and on his face bewilderment looked entirely out of place. "I'm afraid," she corrected. "I'm simply not letting it decide anything for me." The black eyes studied her. Something moved in their depths, not warmth, not yet. But the beginning of a tension, the first stir of something that had been dormant for a very long time. "Come," he said at last. "The forest is not safe tonight." He turned and walked. She followed, because what else could be done? Above them, the blood moon poured its terrible light through the canopy, and the ancient trees of Varenfall whispered to each other in the language of roots and rot, passing a name from one to the next, all the way to the dark heart of the forest, where the oldest things remembered. His name, she learned at dawn, was Valerian. Not from him. He offered no introduction, no explanation, nothing that might be mistaken for welcome. She learned it from the stone above the great door of Varenfall Keep, carved into the lintel arch in letters that had been there so long the rain had rounded their edges. House Valerian, warden of the old blood. She understood then that the name was not just his, it was his inheritance, his title, his entire function in the world reduced to a word. The keep was not what she had expected. She had expected ruin. She had grown up hearing Varenfall Keep described in the village as a desolation, the bones of something that had died. But what she found, following him through a pair of iron doors that opened to no visible key, was controlled grandeur. High ceilings cloaked in shadow, floors of pale stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Tapestries so old, their colors had become a kind of unified gray gold, their subjects barely legible. Battles, she thought, or covenanters, perhaps both. No dust, no cobwebs. He kept it precisely. He showed her to a room on the second floor, not offering to, simply opening the door and stepping aside with the economy of someone who had not had to perform hospitality in a very long time and was doing it from memory rather than feeling. The room was sparse. A bed with gray linens, a wash basin, a window that faced east. "Sleep," he said. "You cannot travel until the moon has set." "It's already nearly morning," she said. "The roads are watched," he said, "not by men." He left before she could form another question, pulling the door to behind him with a click so precise it might have been engineered. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade. Not retreating in haste, just retreating, measured and absolute. And then she went to the window and watched the blood moon sink toward the tree line. "Bloodline of Varenfall," the silver-eyed thing had said. The prophesied girl. She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass and tried to feel something like certainty. She did not sleep. She was too still for sleep. That particular heavy stillness that comes not from calm but from the effort of suppressing everything that wants to move. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the keep breathe around her. The occasional shift of old timber. The distant sound of wind against stone. Once, very faintly, the low sustained note of something like a cello string plucked once and allowed to die. In the morning, true morning, with pale winter light filling the eastern window, she left the room. The corridors were long and adequately lit by narrow windows. She moved through them without hurry, not snooping, only orienting herself because orientation was a kind of security. At the end of the main hall, a door stood half open, and through it she could see a library. She stopped. He was already there. He stood with his back to the door, at a long reading table covered in open books and papers, his attention entirely absorbed. He had removed the outer layer of black and was dressed now in something simpler. Dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, an almost shockingly ordinary appearance that somehow made him more rather than less unsettling. The morning light came across his profile and caught the angles of it in a way the blood moon had not. He was older than his appearance suggested. She could not have said why she knew that. It was not in any visible detail, but in some quality of his presence, a density, as though he carried more time inside him than any single body should contain. He turned before she knocked. "Miss." He stopped. "Isolda," she said. "Isolda Vane." Something crossed his face. Controlled immediately, but she had seen it. A fractional arrest, a stillness beneath the stillness. "I know who you are," he said, which was not what she had expected him to say. "Then you have the advantage of me," she said. "I know your name from the door, but not what you are exactly or why those things in the forest called me by a family name that isn't mine." A long pause. He set down the book he had been holding. "Vane is your grandmother's maiden name," he said. "Her birth name was Varenfall." Isolde stared at him. "That is not possible," she said. "The Varenfall line is ancient, hidden, believed extinct by most." He said it without inflection. "Your grandmother was the last living daughter of the blood. She changed her name when she left this territory, before you were born. It seems she did not explain this to you." "She explained nothing," Isolda said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. He looked at her with those black, fathomless eyes. Not unkindly, exactly, but not with kindness either, with the expression of someone examining a problem they have encountered before and expected to encounter again but still find complicated. "Sit down," he said. "There are things you need to understand before you go back to Ashenmere." "Is it safe to go back?" "Not yet," he said. "No." She sat. He did not, remaining standing at the end of the reading table with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture carrying a formality that suggested he was more accustomed to addressing councils than single young women in inadequate morning light. He looked out the window, and in that moment she noticed the careful distance he kept. Physical, deliberate, as though proximity itself were a risk he was managing. Not from hostility, something more complex than that. She noticed something else. He had not once looked at her directly for longer than a second. Every glance landed and withdrew, like a hand reaching for heat and pulling back before contact. She did not comment on this. She stored it, as she stored everything, in the quiet interior catalog that her grandmother had never warned her she was building. Outside, Varenfall Forest was pale and cold and enormous, its ancient trees standing like a jury that had already reached its verdict. She waited. He told her some of it, but not all of it. This was not evasion in the ordinary sense. She could see that he was choosing his words with the precision of a man who had learned through long experience the cost of saying too much too soon. He spoke in segments, each one complete and correct, but arranged so that the larger architecture remained obscured, the way an experienced cartographer might show you one region without revealing the shape of the continent. The forest was warded territory, his territory, by an arrangement older than the current nation's laws, ratified by something called the Covenant of Ashfall that predated the church and the crown, and everything that had since been built over it. Within Varenfall's borders, he held authority. Outside them, he was bound by the same laws as every other member of the council. The Vampire Council, he said, without particular drama, watching her receive the word vampire with what appeared to be curiosity at her composure. She received it the way her grandmother had always trained her to receive difficult information, by not letting her face become a performance. "My grandmother knew," she said. "It was not a question. Your grandmother was the reason I agreed to the protection terms," he said. "She negotiated them herself. She was remarkable, in her way." There was something in that sentence that was not quite grief and not quite respect, but occupied the space between them. Isolda noted it without pressing. He told her about the silver-eyed things, hollow walkers, he called them, a term that clearly meant something technical in whatever taxonomy he was working from. Old predators who operated outside the Covenant, who had grown bolder as the blood moon approached. They had been searching for the last of the Varenfall bloodline for reasons that he did not elaborate on yet, and would not, she could see, until he had assessed something about her that she had not yet provided him. She did not push. She understood that patience was itself a kind of argument. What she could not entirely account for was the quality of the silence in that library. Valerian was a man, a creature, of very deliberate silences. Not uncomfortable ones, not the silences of avoidance, but silences with shape and intention. Pauses that functioned as sentences. She found herself listening to them. She found herself parsing them. There was a quality to being in his presence that she could not name directly, but felt in the peripheral way. One feels a change in weather before any visible sign confirms it. A kind of atmospheric alteration. A sense that the air itself was paying closer attention. He was standing near the window again, his back half turned. The winter light caught the line of his jaw and the angle of his shoulder, and she noted both, and filed both away carefully, behind the catalog's more neutral entries. "You said the roads are watched," she said. "By the hollow walkers?" "By their handlers," he said. "The hollow walkers are not self-directed, they serve an older master. One that has been searching for the Varenfall lineage since her grandmother disappeared. And now that they've found me, they know you exist. They know you are here." He paused, "which means you cannot return to Aschenmere until I have dealt with their source. How long will that take?" A fractional silence. The kind that meant the answer was complicated. "I don't know," he said. "The blood moon extends their range. Once it passes, 3 days, they will be constrained again. Until then, the keep is the safest location." "I have a father who is ill," she said. Not as an argument exactly. As a fact that required acknowledgement. Something altered in his posture, not softening, more a kind of recalibration, as though the fact introduced a variable he had not calculated. "I can arrange for someone from the village to attend him," he said. "Someone trustworthy. I have." He paused again, and again she heard something beneath the pause. Resources. She looked at him. He was still not looking at her directly. "You don't like people," she said. The statement landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She had not planned to say it aloud. It had arrived, already assembled. He turned, and for one full, unguarded moment, he looked at her directly. Those black eyes entirely open, entirely undefended, before the control reasserted itself and the distance returned. "I am not accustomed to people," he said carefully. "That's different." "Yes," he said, "it is." Another silence, this one longer. She sat with it, and he stood with it, and the library held them both in its paper and shadow smell, and she thought, "He is not accustomed to being known. He is not accustomed to anyone looking closely enough to see the difference." "My father's name is Edmund Vane," she said. "He lives on the eastern edge of Aschenmere, the white house with the blue gate. He takes a medicine called fellwort and ironbark tincture, twice daily. He cannot miss it." Valerian regarded her for a long moment. "I'll send word tonight," he said. "Thank you." He nodded once, the gesture precise and formal, and then turned back to his books as though the conversation had concluded. She remained seated a moment longer, watching his profile, watching the careful way he held himself inside his own silence, and then she rose and left him to it. In the corridor, she stopped and pressed her back to the cold stone wall and allowed herself 3 deep, controlled breaths. Not because she was afraid, because she had recognized something in those black eyes during that single unguarded moment, and the recognition frightened her more than the hollow walkers and the blood moon and the impossible night she had just survived. He was lonely, not in the ordinary way of solitude, in the way of something that has been alone so long it no longer possesses the vocabulary for its own condition. That does not know it is lonely because it has forgotten what the alternative felt. Like, she closed her eyes briefly. Then she went to look for something useful to do, because that had always been the way she managed things she was not ready to think about yet. The keep's kitchen was an argument with grandeur. Everything else, in Varenfall spoke of ancient wealth and careful preservation. But the kitchen was low-ceilinged and practical, its iron stove enormous and clearly functional, its shelves stocked with provisions that someone, not him, she suspected, he did not eat in any way she could observe, had arranged with methodical care. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. A cold pantry held salt pork and preserves and several varieties of dried fruit. Isolda made soup. It was the thing she knew how to do when she was thinking. She was thinking about the word prophesied. The Hollow Walker had used it with a certainty that suggested established knowledge, not rumor. The prophesied girl, as though somewhere there existed a document, a record, something that named her specifically and indicated a purpose. Her grandmother had known about Varenfall, had negotiated with the vampire lord, had changed her name and said almost nothing, but she had given Isolda iron, and she had given Isolda composure, and she had given Isolda the phrase about the blood moon, 3 tools for a specific situation. That was not coincidence, that was preparation. She knew this would happen, Isolda thought, stirring the pot. She knew and she prepared me and she still didn't tell me. Anger was unproductive, but she let herself feel it briefly, like pressing a bruise to confirm it was there, and then she set it aside. She did not hear him enter. The first indication she had that she was not alone was the change in air. The same drop in temperature she had felt in the forest, subtle now rather than dramatic, the atmospheric signature of his presence. She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, regarding her with that expression she was beginning to recognize. The combination of stillness and contained bewilderment, as though the situation consistently produced outcomes his calculations had not predicted. "You're cooking," he said. "The provisions we're going to waste," she said. "They are for guests." A pause. "I have not had guests in some time." "How long is some time?" He looked at the pot rather than at her. 40 years, approximately. She absorbed this, approximately. Time is less precise after a certain point. He said it neutrally, as a man might mention an inconvenience of geography. She set the spoon against the pot's rim and turned fully toward him. "Will you sit?" He looked at the kitchen table. Heavy oak, 4 chairs, a surface scarred with the evidence of previous meals, and the look was one she could not entirely interpret. Something between unfamiliarity and a very old familiarity, as though the image of sitting at a kitchen table existed in his memory in a lair that had been buried a long time. "I don't," he began. "I know you don't eat," she said. "You can still sit." He sat. She turned back to the stove, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. The soup made its steady sound, and the fire in the stove made its steady sound, and the keep settled around them in its ancient, attentive way. "Tell me about the prophecy," she said. A long pause. "There is a record," he said, "in the covenant texts. It has several interpretations, as such records generally do. One interpretation holds that the last of the Varenfall bloodline, female, unbranded, uninitiated, carries a resonance in her blood that can be used to either seal or break the original wards that contain this territory. The Hollow Walker's master wants the wards broken. Varenfall's territory would then become accessible to every old blood faction that has been excluded from it for 4 centuries. Isolda considered this. "And you?" "I want them held," he said. "So I'm either an asset or a target," she said, "depending on which side gets to me first." "A crude summary," he said, "but functionally accurate. What does unbranded mean?" Another pause. Longer. "There is a mark," he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening. "A blood seal. A way of formally inducting a Varenfall heir into the covenant. Once marked, the resonance in the blood is bound. It cannot be used or extracted by force." He stopped. "But it requires something from you," she said, because the pause had the shape of an incomplete sentence. "The seal must be set by the warden of the territory," he said, "by blood, offered voluntarily by both parties." His eyes, fixed on the table surface, did not move. "I told your grandmother I would not do it, that it was too close to." He stopped again. "She left without the seal, which is why you remain vulnerable." Isolda stood very still. In the sudden quiet, she became aware of a distant sound, the high, discordant note of something striking one of the outer wardstones, a vibration that passed through the keep's foundations like a shiver through a spine. They both heard it. Valerian was out of the chair in a motion that was not quite human in its speed, and Isolda, half turning, caught her hand on the edge of the open pantry door. A sharp, clean gash across her palm, immediately bleeding. He went absolutely still. The stillness was different from his other stillnesses. It had a different quality, a tension in it, something controlled so hard it trembled at the edges. His back was to her. She could see the line of his shoulders and what was happening in them, the minute, ferocious effort. "There's a cloth on the middle shelf," she said calmly. A beat. He went to the shelf and retrieved the cloth without turning to face her, and held it out behind him, his gaze fixed on the stone wall, and she took it and wrapped her palm. "Go upstairs," he said. "Lock the door. The ward has been struck. Something is testing the boundary. I'm not going to be useful upstairs." "You are not supposed to be useful," he said, and his voice had changed entirely rougher, stripped of its measured cadence, something underneath it that she was not sure had a polite name. "You're supposed to be safe. Please, go upstairs." She went, but she heard him as she left release one long, controlled breath, and even from the corridor she could hear the effort it had cost him. The ward held. She knew this because by the time the pale gray of early evening crept under her door, the subsonic vibration had ceased, and the keep had returned to its customary stillness. She had spent the intervening hours at the room's small writing desk, doing the things she did when she needed to impose order on disorder, she wrote, not journal entries. She had never been given to the confessional mode, but lists. What she knew. What she didn't know. What she needed to find out. The list of what she didn't know was considerably longer. He knocked twice before entering, which she noticed as she noticed everything. One knock was announcement. 2 was courtesy. He looked the same as always. Controlled, correct, every visible thing about him arranged with precision. But there was something around the edges that had not been there this morning, a kind of carefully managed aftermath, the look of someone who had done something difficult and was in the process of closing the accounts on it. "The Hollow Walkers are retreating," he said. "The ward held, but the stones are weakened. The blood moon will crest tomorrow night. At that point, whatever is directing them will make a direct approach rather than testing the perimeter. So we have 1 day," she said. 1 day to prepare, yes." She looked at her wrapped hand. The cut was shallow. It had already stopped bleeding properly, only seeping slightly at the edges. "And a seal," she said. "You said you refused my grandmother because it was too close to something. What was the something?" He was quiet for a long moment. He had taken the chair near the window and was sitting in it, in that way he had of making even ordinary postures seem formal. Spine straight, hands resting on the arms, the posture of a man accustomed to thrones. "Bonding," he said at last. "The seal is a form of it. Old blood recognizes old blood, and a willing exchange, even a small one, creates a tether. Not full bonding, but a thread, a connection that persists." He looked at the window, not at her. "I did not believe it appropriate to do that to your grandmother. She was elderly, and she had a family and a life that had nothing to do with the Covenant's obligations." "And me?" Isolda said. The question sat in the room between them. "You're different," he said, and the plainness of it, refusal to decorate or deflect, was itself a kind of admission. "Because the blood moon is tomorrow night," she said. "Because there's less time. Because," he stopped, started again. "Because you are the last. There is no one after you. If something happens to you, the Varenfall bloodline ends, and the old wards fail over time, and the territory becomes contested, and a great number of very old and very dangerous things are released into the world." He paused. "That is why." It was the right answer. She was quite sure it was not the only answer. "Tell me what you remember about my grandmother," she said, because she wanted to see what memory did to his face. What it did was complex. The controlled expression did not shatter. He was far too old and far too disciplined for that, but it changed in texture. became less like marble and more like stone that has been in weather a long time. Worn. Honest. She was 63 when she came to me, he said. She arrived alone at night and knocked on the door of the keep, which no one had done in my living memory. She sat where you are sitting and she told me what she knew about her lineage and what she suspected about the Hollow Walkers and what she intended to do about both. She was direct. A pause, and something that might have been the ghost of something warmer briefly inhabiting his face. She reminded me of why people were interesting once, before I had been alone long enough to forget. Isolda held this quietly. She never told me about you, she said. She never told me about any of this. I know. She believed that knowing would make you a target earlier than necessary. She wanted you to have as much ordinary life as possible before. He gestured slightly, an economical gesture that encompassed the keep, the blood moon, the Hollow Walkers, everything, before the debt came due, Isolda said. He looked at her sharply. She used to say that, Isolda explained. The blood moon will rise again when the old debt comes due. I thought it was a saying. It was a description, he said quietly. The debt is specific. 400 years ago, a previous Varenfall lord, not of my line, but allied with it, made a compact with the thing that now directs the Hollow Walkers. He promised it access to the warded territory in exchange for something I have never fully understood. He died before the debt was collected. The compact transferred to his bloodline. He paused. Your bloodline. The blood moon is its method of calling in what was owed. So, I am the debt, Isolda said. You are the collateral, he said. Yes. She looked at her hands, the wrapped one, the unwrapped one, and breathed steadily through the weight of this. 400 years of accumulated obligation bearing down on her through the accident of her birth, through a compact she had never signed. Then the seal, she said. The blood seal would break the compact's claim on me? It would rebind you to the covenant instead, he said, effectively superseding the older claim. Yes. Then we should do it, she said. He looked at her, truly looked, the full, unguarded attention she had only briefly glimpsed before, and this time he did not look away immediately. It is permanent, he said. The tether doesn't break. Neither does being dead, she said. A silence. Very long. Outside, the wind moved through the Varenfall trees with a sound like an intake of breath. Tomorrow, he said at last. After I have prepared the space properly. Tonight. Rest. She nodded. He stood to leave. Valerian, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. For the forest, for all of it. He was still for a moment, and she saw again that quality she had noticed in the library. The thing that lived in him like a room that had been locked so long. The air inside had gone entirely still. Sleep, he said, and left. She found the record herself, in the library, in the deep hours before dawn, when the blood moon's second-to-last rising cast the keep in shades of red and copper. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had come down for a candle, finding herself unable to sleep. And then the library had presented itself as a library always does to a certain kind of mind. Inevitable, necessary, the correct room for the current problem. She had spent an hour moving through the shelves in the careful way of someone who respects other people's arrangements, reading spines, opening nothing without consideration. The covenant texts were on the lowest shelf of the northeastern case, bound in leather so old it had gone gray, their titles pressed rather than printed. She found the relevant volume by following the index, methodical, unglamorous, effective, and she found the passage after another 20 minutes. It was written in a formal register of an older English, stiff but decipherable, and the blood of Varenfall-born feminine, sealed before the debt's calling, shall be recognized by the warden's mark as belonging to the covenant rather than the compact's claim. The warden must offer his blood in turn, a drop, willingly given, and speak the binding name of the one to be sealed. The name must be known truly, not guessed. The seal holds only if both parties are present without compulsion. She read this 3 times. The name must be known truly. She set the book down carefully and sat back in the library chair. He had said he knew who she was when she gave her name. He had known her grandmother. He had known the Varenfall lineage, had been its warden for, she did not want to calculate how long, but the date above the door was old enough to make the number uncomfortable. He would know her name. That was not the difficulty. The difficulty was the second part, both parties without compulsion. She turned this over. He had offered the seal, or rather, he had agreed to it when she pressed, but she had heard the hesitation. She had felt it in the pauses of his voice. Not unwillingness, exactly, more like the reluctance of someone being asked to open a door that they have good reasons to keep shut. The tether, he had said, a connection that persists. She was sitting with this, the library around her, doing what good libraries did, which was to make silence feel productive. When she became aware that she was not alone, he was standing in the doorway. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the room in the red cast candlelight. The covenant text was open in her lap, the relevant passage visible, and she watched him see it. "You were reading," he said, and his voice was different at this hour. Quieter, strict of some professional layer. The way voices are at 3 a.m, when the architecture of performed composure has been worn thinner by the dart. "I needed to understand the mechanics," she said. He came into the room, moving to the other side of the reading table rather than toward her, putting the table between them. Not hostility. She was beginning to understand this as his form of care. Maintaining distance was how he managed things he did not trust himself to manage up close. "The name must be known truly," she said. "I wanted to confirm what that meant." "It means what it says." He sat, and this time the sitting was less formal, less throne-like, closer to the way a very tired person sits, a true name in the old sense. Not just the given name, but the full truth of a person as understood by the one speaking it. He paused. "It's an old safeguard against compelled sealing. You cannot name someone truly if you don't know them." "You've known me 4 days," she said. "I know enough," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, but his posture had changed. The control was still there, the precision, but underneath it she could hear the thing that lived in his silences, the locked room, beginning to have sound. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Not a question, in inflection, more of an offering. He nodded. "How long have you been alone here?" A long pause. "Since 1743, he said. She absorbed this. 1743 to now, 283 years. Approximately. "By choice?" she asked. He looked up. "By consequence," he said. "I had—" Another pause, this one with more weight. "People, once, a household. Allies within the council. But the council changed, its laws changed. What I am unwilling to do put me outside its good standing, and what I am willing to do made me their problem." He paused again, and when he continued his voice was very even, the evenness of something that has been handled until all the sharp edges are smooth. "I stopped needing them, and they stopped needing me, and the forest remained. And the humans in Ashenmere," she said. "You protect them too through the wards, but you never—" "No," he said. "I do not involve myself." "Why?" The pause this time was the longest yet. "Because I do not hate them," he said carefully. "I have never hated them, but I have found, over a long time, that the closer I am to them, the more I am reminded of what I am not." He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and I believed it better, for them and for me, to remain at a distance that made such reminders less frequent. Isolda sat with this for a while. Outside the windows, the blood moon was 3/4 down the sky, pulling its red light with it. "You were wrong about one thing," she said at last. He raised an eyebrow. The first genuinely unguarded expression she had seen from him. Uncomplicated surprise. "What I am not afraid of is not being afraid," she said. "It's deciding that what I'm afraid of is less important than what's in front of me." She looked at him steadily. "You've been deciding the opposite. For 283 years. He did not answer, but in the candlelight she watched something move across his face. Slow, tectonic. the kind of movement that happens deep before the surface shows it. She picked up the covenant text and carried it back to the shelf. "Tomorrow evening, then," she said. "The seal." "Tomorrow evening," he confirmed, and his voice was very quiet. She left him in the library with the candles and the sound of the old trees, and did not look back. He had not been moved by a human in longer than he cared to accurately calculate. He was honest with himself about this. In the deep hours after she had gone upstairs, honest in the way he was honest about most things, which was to say unflinchingly and without the comfort of euphemism. He had been moved. Something in the landscape of him had shifted, the way the earth shifts before an earthquake that has been building for years. Not suddenly, but inevitably, following a pressure that had been accumulating since the moment in the forest when she had looked at him and said, "I'm afraid. I'm simply not letting it decide anything for me." He knew what she was. He had known the moment she turned toward him in the forest, the blood moon lighting her face, the last Varenfall air, the collateral of an ancient debt, the figure named in the covenant texts in terms that were not romantic but felt, in the presence of her actual person, like a catastrophic understatement. He had also known that she was going to be a problem. Not in the way the Hollow Walkers were a problem. Not a threat to be managed, or a variable to be controlled. A problem of a different category. The kind that dismantled careful arrangements simply by existing. By being precisely the shape that fit the space that had been empty for so long, he had stopped noticing the shape of the space. He had maintained the distance. He had kept to the table, the window, the far end of rooms. He had not looked at her directly for more than necessary, because looking directly at something is how you begin to know it, and knowing it is how it enters the parts of you that have been silent for a very long time and puts sound into them. He had done all of this correctly. She had dismantled it anyway, not through any effort on her part, but simply through the consistent, quiet quality of her attention. The way she listened, the way she did not perform, the way she had made soup in his kitchen and sat at his table as though these were ordinary things, as though this keep had always been the kind of place where ordinary things happened. He stood now at the window of the library, the blood moon finally gone, and the sky shifted to the deep, honest black that precedes dawn. And he allowed himself to understand the problem clearly. Tomorrow the seal must be set. He must take her hand and open a small wound and offer a drop of his own blood and say her name, her true name, as he understood it. And in doing so, he would create a tether, not full bonding, nothing irrevocable, but a thread, a persistent connection between his existence and hers. He had refused this with her grandmother because her grandmother's life had been its own complete thing, with no room in it for threads to 400-year-old cursed lords and forests. He could not find the same refusal for Isolda, and that too was something he was honest with himself about. Alone in the dark, it was not only practicality, it was not only the Blood Moon's deadline or the Hollow Walkers or the duty of his office. There was something else in the willingness. Something older and quieter, and he filed it in the same locked room with all the other things he was not yet prepared to address. The door of the library opened. He turned. Isolde stood in the doorway in her traveling coat, her hair loose, her face carrying the expression of controlled urgency he had begun to associate with her. Not panic, but precision applied to something moving fast. In her hand she held a piece of paper. "There's a note," she said. "It was under the door. Someone has been in the keep." He crossed the room in 2 strides and took the paper. It was written in a hand he recognized. Old blood script, the written form of a dialect used only within specific council factions. The message was simple: deliver the girl to the eastern gate by midnight, or we take the village instead. Varenfall Forest. Someone had crossed the ward boundary, someone with enough power, or enough knowledge, to slip past the weakened stones and enter the keep. "Get upstairs," he said. "No," she said calmly. "If they're inside the ward, upstairs isn't safer." She was right. He hated that she was right. He thought quickly. The ward stones, weakened by yesterday's attack, would be at their lowest resistance before the Blood Moon's final rise at midnight. That gave them 6 hours. The node's deadline was theatrical, a pressure tactic, but the threat to the village was real. The Hollow Walker's master had shown its hand now. Direct confrontation. A choice between Isolde and the villagers. It understood him. It knew he would not sacrifice the village. It's trying to force the choice before the seal can be set, Isolda said. She had reached the same calculation faster than he had, which he noted with something between exasperation and something warmer that he did not examine. Yes, he said. So we set the seal now, she said, before midnight, and then its claim on me is nullified regardless. The preparation. What does the preparation actually require? She said. Specifically, the covenant text said the seal needs the space to be prepared. What does that mean? He looked at her. It means I need a surface that's been consecrated to covenant law. In this keep, that is. He stopped. Where? The Great Hall, he said. The floor is covenant stone. Then the Great Hall, she said. Now, we have 6 hours and someone is already inside the boundary. Stop preparing and start. He studied her face for one moment, the steadiness of her, the complete unflinching readiness, and then he said, "Follow me." The Great Hall was at the keep's center, its ceiling the highest in the building, its floor laid in alternating pale and dark stone that had been here when the foundation was first set. Valerian moved to the room's center and crouched, pressing his palm flat against the pale stone, and felt it respond. The old covenant resonance rising in the rock like heat from deep ground, recognizing the warden's touch. "Come here," he said. She came and stood before him as he rose, and he looked at her fully, for the first time without withdrawal. "Give me your hand," he said, "the injured one." She unwrapped the cloth from her palm and held it out. He took it carefully, more carefully than the action required, his thumb resting at the inside of her wrist, over the pulse which he could feel and tried not to. His other hand moved to his own forearm, where he opened a small cut with the edge of his thumbnail with the practiced economy of someone who had done this many times. A drop of his blood to her palm, a drop of hers, still seeping, already offered. He raised his eyes to hers. "Your name," he said quietly, "as I know it truly, Isolda Vane, called Varenfall by blood and debt, who is afraid and proceeds anyway, who listens to silences, who makes soup in empty kitchens, who holds a locked room open until it learns to breathe." A pause, bound now to this covenant and this territory, protected by its warden, belonging to no compact that preceded this moment. The covenant stone beneath their feet hummed, and somewhere beyond the keep's walls something ancient and furious let out a sound that was not quite a scream, but performed the same function, and then went silent. The blood moon rose, blood red over the Varenfall trees, and it had nothing left to claim. The hollow walkers did not come. There was movement in the forest. She could hear it. Standing with him at the great hall's tall window as the blood moon climbed, a thrashing in the undergrowth that suggested panic rather than pursuit, shapes moving outward rather than inward, the retreat of something that had just encountered a closed door where it expected an open one. She watched until the movement stopped, and the forest went still, and the blood moon was the only thing left performing. Then she became aware of his hand. He was still holding hers, not tightly, loosely, the grip that had been functional during the seal and had not been released, as though neither of them had registered the continued contact. His thumb was still at her wrist. She could feel his temperature against hers. He was cold, but not unpleasantly so. Cold in the way marble floors were cold in summer, a contrast rather than an absence. She did not move her hand. He did not move his. After a moment she said very quietly, "Is it done?" "Yes," he said. "And the compact's claim, nullified, completely." He paused. "The seal is bound. You belong to the covenant now, not to the old debt. You belong." The phrasing landed differently from how he had perhaps intended it, or perhaps exactly as intended. She couldn't tell, and that uncertainty was new. She was accustomed to reading people. She was not accustomed to people she couldn't entirely read. "The tether," she said. "The thread. Can you feel it?" A pause that had weight. "Yes," he said. She looked at their joined hands and then looked up at him and found him already looking at her. Not the glancing, immediately retracted attention of the past few days, but the full, unflinching regard she had only seen twice before. He was not hiding it this time. "What does it feel like?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him choosing, not between truth and falsehood, but between levels of truth, calibrating how much of the interior landscape to make visible. "Like a room that has been empty for a long time," he said, suddenly containing sound. She held this quietly, the way she held the things that mattered, carefully, without squeezing. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I knew when I agreed to the seal that it was permanent," she said. "I wasn't being brave or practical. I was being practical, but that wasn't the only reason." She looked at the blood moon through the window. "I've been alone in my own way. Not for 200 years, but the kind of alone that comes from being legible to yourself in ways that are inconvenient, seeing things clearly enough that the ordinary conversations people have feel like watching a play in the language you speak too well." She paused. "And I recognize something in you. I don't know if that's the bloodline or just, I don't know." His hand shifted almost imperceptibly, not releasing, but the grip changing quality slightly. She felt it. "It is not only the bloodline," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that same quality she had seen in the library, the worn, weathered truth beneath the marble. And she thought, he has been building to this the entire time, not this moment, not any specific moment, but the capacity for this. "Whatever this is, I owe you a more complete explanation," he said. "Of the covenant, of what the seal means going forward, of what is now possible and what is not, and what you might want to consider." "You're hedging," she said gently. "I am being responsible," he said, but the faintest alteration in his expression suggested he recognized the distinction was possibly smaller than he was asserting. "You can be responsible tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, can we just—" She paused, looking for the right word and finding only an honest one. "Stand here for a while?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very carefully, as though each degree of movement were a decision, he shifted. Not toward her, not dramatically, just enough that the space between them shortened from deliberate to incidental. The distance that had been managed and precise became something else, something that suggested proximity arrived at naturally rather than maintained against the pull of something larger. She did not move either, but she was aware of everything. The warmth of her own hand against his. The blood moon's red light pooling on the pale stone floor. The immense, attending silence of the Varenfold trees. "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "We can stand here for a while." The blood moon completed its crossing of the sky in the hours that followed, moving from red to copper to pale gold as dawn began its preparation at the eastern edge of the world. They remained, not speaking much, not needing to. She thought at one point that she could feel something she could not see. The thread, the tether, the seal's consequence, a presence that was not quite her own, existing alongside her internal weather. Something old and contained and she thought carefully glad. The way something is glad when it has been waiting a long time and has mostly stopped believing the waiting would end. She did not say this aloud, but she thought he felt it too, because at some point in the slow progress of the night, he released her hand and she thought the thread drew a fraction tighter, as though compensating for the loss of contact, or simply reminding them both that the connection now existed in a layer that hands and proximity could not fully address. Dawn arrived gray and cold and ordinary, and neither of them moved for a long time after it did. 3 days after the blood moon, she sent word to Ashenmere. Her father was well. The messenger Valerian had dispatched had been reliable, the fellwort and ironbark tincture administered on schedule. No emergency had arisen. Edmund Vane was, by all accounts, simply waiting for his daughter to come home, as he always waited for her, with patience and without fuss. The trait she suspected she had inherited from him rather than developing on her own. She sat at the library table with the letter in her hands and thought about the word home for longer than was probably necessary. In 4 days, Varenfall Keep had reorganized itself around her without asking permission. The kitchen was no longer unused. The library had 2 chairs at the table instead of 1. He had stopped standing in doorways and had begun, tentatively, with the quality of something consulting a long-dormant memory. Sitting in the same room as her without requiring a stated reason, he read. She read. The fire in the library hearth became a shared thing. She was honest with herself. She did not know what to call this. She did not have a vocabulary for it that did not feel either insufficient or premature. Something was building between them the way storms built. Not suddenly, but with gathering unmistakability, pressure accumulating in the upper atmosphere while the surface remained clear. She was also honest with herself about something else. She was not ready to leave. This was complicated. It was complicated because her father needed her, because Ashenmere was her home, because she had obligations and a life that existed outside this stone forest estate and the company of a vampire lord who was slowly, painfully, learning to be in the same room as another person without treating it as a risk to be managed. She was honest about the complication without immediately resolving it. When she brought him the letter, he read it in 2 minutes and set it on the library table. "You should go," he said, and his voice was correct and measured and gave nothing away except, if you were listening to the underside of his pauses, a precise kind of loss. "I know," she said. "I will." She sat down. "But first, I need to understand the seal better, what it means for my life going forward, what I can and cannot do." This was true, and it was also, she was aware, a delaying tactic. She filed this under things she would be honest about later. He explained it carefully. The seal did not change her life in any visible way. She was protected, bound to the Covenant safeguards, which meant the old compact could never reclaim her, and the Hollow Walker's master had lost its leverage permanently. She could live in Ashenmere, tend to her father, pursue whatever existed of her ordinary life. The tether would not summon her, or compel her, or interfere with her choices. "But," she said, hearing the shape of an unfinished sentence. "But it will make certain things more apparent," he said. "States of distress. Physical danger. Should you ever be in serious danger, I will know. You'll feel it through the thread," she said. "Yes, and if you're in danger—" A pause. "In theory," he said carefully, "it works in both directions." She absorbed this. In both directions. She would feel it if he was in danger. She thought about that, about what it would mean to be sitting in her father's house in Ashenmere in the ordinary afternoon light, and feel through some interior channel that Valerian was in pain. "I'll come," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want you to come," he said. "If I'm in danger, the nature of my danger is such that your presence would—" "I'll come anyway," she said. And she said it the way she had said most things in the past 4 days, not as a challenge, not as performance, simply as fact. "This is true. This will happen. I'll come anyway." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the elaborate internal argument resolve itself on his face, the part that wanted to protest winning briefly and then losing to the part that recognized the statement was not a proposal but a statement of character, and that arguing with character was not a productive use of his very considerable intelligence. "I know," he said at last, and it carried in it all the things the longer silence had contained. They sat without speaking for a while. Outside, Varenfall Forest was pale and quiet, the blood moon entirely gone, the sky a clean winter white. "You said you had people, once," she said, "before 1743. "Yes, what happened to them?" He looked at the window. The council declared a purge of what they called aberrant wardens, those who refused to conform to the new laws on human contact. Wardens who had relationships with humans or who protected humans in ways the council considered excessive. He paused. "My household was not human, but they were loyal to me rather than to the council, which amounted to the same charge." She waited. "I survived," he said. "I survived and I held the ward and I remained." The word was careful. It was the precise word for what it had been, not living, not flourishing. Remaining. Persisting as a fact in a landscape that had organized itself around his absence. "And the council now?" she said. "Distant," he said. "They have their laws. I have the forest. We do not interfere with each other." "They can't override the seal?" she said. "No," he said. "The seal is pre-covenant. It predates their authority. It cannot be overridden by anything except the death of one of the parties. He paused, which is another reason the Hollow Walker's master wanted you before it was set. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him. The full, direct look she had been giving him since the beginning. The one that had been discomfiting him and interesting him and, she thought, doing something more complicated than either for the past 4 days. "I'll come back," she said. "I'll go to Ashenmere. I'll see my father. I'll settle things. And then I'll come back." He did not ask why. She appreciated this. "The keep will be here," he said. "So will you," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said. "So will I." She rose, picked up her traveling coat from the chair and folded it over her arm. She was aware of the tether. She had been aware of it since the seal, a low, persistent warmth in the center of her chest that was not hers exactly. That carried a quality she was slowly learning to identify. She thought of the locked room. She thought of it having air in it now. Finally, after 283 years. "Walk me to the door," she said. He did. At the great iron door of the keep, with the pale winter morning laid out before her across the Varenfall tree line, she turned and looked at him one more time. "Don't lock anything," she said. "While I'm gone." He understood her. She could see it in the fractional softening of his expression, the slight lowering of that perpetual guard. "I won't," he said. She walked into the forest and did not look back, because she knew from the warmth in her chest that she did not need to. He stood at the door of the keep for a long time after she disappeared into the trees. The forest was its usual self, enormous, patient, indifferent to anything as small as his current state. He had stood at this door hundreds of times over the past centuries, watching the tree line in the way of someone who has nothing specific to watch for, who watches out of habit because habit is the armature that holds long time together. He had done it without feeling anything in particular, which was not numbness. He had been careful, always, to distinguish between numbness and the genuine quiet of a life that has minimized its points of exposure. This was different. He was aware of her through the tether. She was walking steadily. She was thinking. He could not read the specific contents of what she was thinking, but he could feel the quality of it, focused and warm and carrying somewhere in its depths a particular note that he recognized, because it matched something in himself that he had been trying to decide what to call. He stayed at the door until the note through the tether shifted to the one that meant distance, the slight muting that happened when she was beyond the word boundary and moving into the world proper. Then he went inside. The keep was the same as it had always been. The same proportions, the same stone and shadow and carefully maintained silence. He moved through it and noticed that it was the same, and also, somehow, not. The kitchen had a smell that was not his, herb broth, and something sweet, the lingering signature of the soup she had made. The library table had 2 chairs still, and the second chair carried the impression of recent use in a way that made the library seem larger than it had before she arrived, not smaller, as though her presence had expanded the space rather than occupying it. He sat down. He sat in his chair at the end of the long table, and he looked at the second chair, and he allowed himself, without qualification, to feel the shape of what the past 4 days had been. He had not wanted to feel it while she was here. There had been too much to manage. The blood moon, the hollow walkers, the seal, the accumulated explanations and silences, and the careful architecture of proximity and distance. But now he was alone, and she was on her way to Ashenmere, and the tether was a warm thread in the center of his chest, and he allowed himself to feel it without management. She had said, "I recognize something in you." He closed his eyes. He had recognized something in her too, from the first moment in the forest, when she had looked at him and said with perfect composure that she was afraid and not letting it decide anything. He had stood on the root arch of that oak tree and looked at her face in the blood moon's light, and something in the deep strata of him, something that had been sediment for 2 centuries, compressed and still and heavy, had shifted. He had told himself it was the bloodline resonance. He had told himself it was the practical urgency of the blood moon crisis. He had told himself every reasonable, structural, non-personal thing there was to tell himself, and all of it had been true, and none of it had been the whole truth. The whole truth was this: she had looked at him and not looked away. That was all. In 400 years, this was what it had taken. Back to Isolde. She was back in 9 days. Her father had recovered enough to sit at the kitchen table and eat solid food, which was the true benchmark she had been waiting for. Everything short of that was ambiguous. But a man sitting up to eat soup was a man on the right side of his illness. She had arranged for the neighbor's daughter, a capable girl named Marin, to check on him daily. She had settled her accounts with the apothecary, packed a bag that was larger than the first one, and walked out of the White House with the blue gate into the winter morning. She did not think of it as leaving. She thought of it as going to a different kind of home, which was new enough as a thought that she carried it carefully, the way you carry something that hasn't hardened yet. The forest knew her now. She could feel it. Not imagined, not the artifact of an overworked mind, but the actual tactile sense of the ward responding to her blood seal as she crossed the boundary, a low vibration in the air, like recognition. The trees were bare and silver-barked in the winter, and beautiful in the spare way that stripped-back things were beautiful. Everything reduced to its structural truth. He was at the door when she arrived. Not waiting at it, he had been inside, she was certain, and had come out when the tether told him she was close. He stood on the threshold in his black coat, the pale winter light doing what it always did to his face, and he looked at her with the expression she had been sitting with for 9 days, the unlocked one. She stopped at the base of the stone steps and looked up. "You're here," he said. "I said I would be," she said. He moved down the steps, not hastily, but with a decision and the movement that was new. He stopped on the step above her, which put their eyes on the same level, and he looked at her for a moment with all the unguarded quality she had been the reason for. "How is your father?" he said. "Better," she said, sitting up, eating. A pause. He asked where I'd been. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "Most of it." Something moved in his expression. Almost a smile. Not the ghost of one, but the first actual structural evidence that one was possible. "And how did he receive it?" "He said," she said carefully, "that my grandmother always said I would end up somewhere strange and necessary." He seemed unsurprised. This time the smile arrived, briefly, fully, transforming his face for just a moment into something that was not marble, not ancient, not any of the things that made him difficult, but simply itself, real. She felt the tether warm. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "Valerian," she said. He stopped. She stood on the step below him and looked up and said, "I know what I'm doing. I want you to know that I know. I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be, or because the seal compelled me, or because the past 9 days were anything other than exactly what I said they would be." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm here because I want to be here." He was very still. Then he reached out, and with the careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did, he took her gloved hand in both of his. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known since the forest. Since I wasn't afraid." "Since you told me you were," he said, "and came anyway." The Varenfall trees stood in their winter patience around them, rooted in the old dark, full of the memory of everything that had passed and the knowledge in the way of very old things of what was arriving. Above the tree line the sky was a clean, cold white, empty of moons both ordinary and terrible. She went inside. He followed. The great iron door of Varenfall Keep closed behind them both, and the sound it made was not the sound of a thing locking. It was the sound of a thing finally, completely opening.